May 1945. France and Belgium. The war in Europe had ended. Allied POW camps, once filled with captured enemy soldiers, now prepared for mass repatriation. Officers expected jubilation, men eager to return home after years of captivity. Instead, reports arrived that baffled commanders. German prisoners were requesting to remain in custody. These were not isolated cases. Across multiple camps, soldiers who had sworn allegiance to the Reich now begged not to be freed. Their cities lay in ruins. 70% of Berlin had been destroyed. Starvation loomed. Violence threatened. The choice seemed impossible, yet they chose barbed wire over freedom. Men who fought for Germany now feared Germany itself. Commanders stood confused, holding discharge papers prisoners refused to sign. How could captivity seem safer than liberation? This is the story of men who feared their homeland more than their captors, and the hidden cost of war no one calculated. On May 8, 1945, the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany became official. Church bells rang across liberated Europe. In Paris, crowds danced in the streets. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed cheering masses from the balcony of the Ministry of Health. The European theater of World War II had ended after 5 years, 8 months, and 7 days of devastating conflict. But the war's logistics continued. Approximately 7 million prisoners of war remained scattered across Europe. German, Italian, and other Axis soldiers filled POW camps in France, Belgium, Britain, and the United States occupied zones of Germany. Allied military planners had prepared detailed repatriation schedules. Transport trains stood ready. Discharge papers had been printed. The assumption seemed logical. After years of captivity, these men would rush home to rebuild their lives. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France, coordinated the massive operation. His staff anticipated processing 50,000 POWs daily through rail networks. The Geneva Conventions mandated prompt repatriation once hostilities ceased. Everything appeared straightforward. Load the trains, send them home, close the camps. Then the reports began arriving. Camp commanders in northeastern France sent telegrams to headquarters. POW processing officers in Belgium filed unusual incident reports. The messages shared a disturbing pattern. German soldiers were asking not to be repatriated, not just a handful, hundreds, then thousands. Major William H. Hunt, overseeing repatriation logistics at Camp 302 near Reims, documented the first cases in his daily log. Prisoner Vogel, Hans, service number 4371829, refused discharge orders. States returning to Hamburg would mean certain death. Requests extended detention. Similar entries filled page after page. Officers conducting discharge interviews found themselves in bizarre negotiations with men begging to stay imprisoned. The phenomenon contradicted every assumption about human behavior in wartime. Prisoners traditionally counted days until freedom. They carved calendars on cell walls. They dreamed of home. Liberation meant everything. Yet here, in the spring of 1945, enemy soldiers rejected freedom when offered. The question echoed through Allied command. What waited in Germany that seemed worse than captivity? The answer lay in the devastation of Germany itself. As Allied forces had advanced into German territory through late 1944 and early 1945, they encountered systematic destruction on an unprecedented scale. Strategic bombing campaigns by the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces had targeted German cities methodically. Industrial centers, transportation hubs, residential districts. The cumulative effect was catastrophic. Berlin, once Europe's third-largest city, had been reduced to rubble. 70% of its buildings stood destroyed or severely damaged. The Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, bombed in November 1943, remained a skeletal ruin. Unter den Linden, the famous boulevard, was impassable. Approximately 1.2 million Berliners had fled or died. Those remaining lived in cellars and bomb shelters. Dresden presented an even more shocking picture. On February 13 through 15, 1945, Allied bombers had created a firestorm that consumed the historic city center. Temperature estimates reached 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The Baroque architecture of the Frauenkirche collapsed. Death toll estimates ranged from 25,000 to 40,000 civilians. The city that Mozart and Goethe had admired became an ash field. Hamburg had endured Operation Gomorrah in July and August 1943. Over 7 nights, British and American bombers dropped 9,000 tons of explosives and incendiaries. The resulting firestorm killed approximately 42,000 civilians. Winds reached 150 miles per hour. People caught in streets were incinerated where they stood. Survivors described the Elbe River boiling, but physical destruction told only part of the story. Germany faced complete systemic collapse. The Nazi government had disintegrated. Local authorities had vanished or fled. Police forces disbanded. Courts closed. Hospitals ran without medicine or power. Water treatment plants lay destroyed. Sewage systems failed. Disease spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Food supplies had become critically scarce. In 1945, the average German civilian consumed approximately 1,500 calories daily, less than half the minimum required for manual labor. British occupation authorities documented widespread malnutrition. Children showed symptoms of rickets and scurvy. Adults suffered from edema caused by protein deficiency. In Berlin alone, an estimated 1 million civilians faced starvation by summer's end. A report from the German municipal government in May 1945 stated, "The population has been reduced by 15%. 1 million civilians have died from starvation, disease, and exposure since January 1st. Germany had become a graveyard of cities inhabited by ghosts waiting to die. By June 1945, the requests from German POWs had become systematic. Camp officers kept detailed records. At Stalag Thementhi See, near Würzburg, approximately 2,000 prisoners formally petitioned Allied authorities to extend their detention. At Stalag Thementhi near Moosburg, the number exceeded 3,000. Similar patterns emerged at camps across France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The prisoners came predominantly from major urban centers: Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, Essen. They had been captured in the war's final months, some during the Rhine crossings in March, others during the Ruhr pocket collapse in April, still more in the chaotic final days before surrender. Most were young conscripts, 17 to 25 years old, pressed into service during Germany's desperate final mobilization. Their reasons, documented in Allied intelligence reports, followed consistent themes. They feared returning to cities where their homes no longer existed. They feared starvation in a country with no functioning food distribution. They feared retribution from civilians, angry at years of Nazi rule. Most fundamentally, they feared chaos, the complete absence of law, order, and social structure. A psychological assessment conducted by U.S. Army medical officers at Camp 302 noted, "These men exhibit severe anxiety regarding repatriation. Many have received letters from family members describing conditions at home as desperate. Some have received no correspondence at all, suggesting their families may be dead or displaced. The prospect of returning to uncertainty appears to outweigh the desire for freedom." Camp commanders faced an unprecedented dilemma. The Geneva Conventions clearly stipulated that prisoners of war must be repatriated promptly after hostilities ended. Detention beyond military necessity violated international law. Yet forcing traumatized men back to devastated cities raised serious humanitarian concerns. Allied authorities had not anticipated needing to convince enemy soldiers to accept freedom. The British Army's military police compiled a report in late June that documented the scope. There has been a marked increase in the number of POWs, especially those from major cities, requesting extended stays. Some have offered to perform labor in exchange for continued housing and rations. Others have simply refused to sign discharge papers. Physical force would be required to remove them from camps. At General Eisenhower's headquarters, staff officers debated the situation's legal and moral dimensions. They consulted military lawyers. They reviewed Geneva Convention provisions. They sent urgent queries to Washington and London seeking guidance. One officer's memo captured the confusion. "We fought to free Europe from tyranny. Now our enemies beg us not to free them. What does this mean?" The logistics of repatriation had been planned with military precision. The United States Army's Transportation Corps had allocated 4,000 rail cars specifically for POW movement. Routes had been mapped through France and Belgium into the American and British occupation zones of Germany. Processing centers stood ready to receive returnees. Discharge stations would provide basic supplies, a uniform change, 3 days' rations, identification papers, and travel permits. The system was designed to move 50,000 men daily. Allied planners calculated that 7 million prisoners could be fully repatriated within 4 to 5 months. Summer 1945 would see the camps cleared. By autumn, the POW system would be dismantled. Resources could then shift to European reconstruction. But the unexpected requests disrupted these careful schedules. When prisoners refused discharge, processing ground to a halt. Trains departed partially full. Reception centers in Germany stood empty, while camps in France remained overcrowded. The mathematical precision of military logistics collided with the unpredictable complexity of human fear. Major William H. Hunt documented the impact in his operational reports. Repatriation goals not being met. Daily processing has fallen to 32,000 due to prisoner resistance. Camps designed for 60-day maximum occupancy now hold men for 90 days or longer. Overcrowding is creating sanitation and health concerns. Food supplies, calculated for rapid turnover, are running short. The camps themselves were never designed for comfortable long-term habitation. Most consisted of tents or temporary wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Toilet facilities were rudimentary. Bathing arrangements minimal. Medical facilities basic. For short-term detention before repatriation, such conditions were acceptable under Geneva Convention standards. For extended stays, they became problematic, yet prisoners still preferred these conditions to what awaited in Germany. A report from Camp Victor, located near Châlons-en-Champagne, stated, "Despite overcrowding and poor conditions, prisoners have formed a petition with 473 signatures requesting permission to remain. They cite fears of returning to bombed cities where no housing, employment, or food distribution exists." The situation presented Allied commanders with a profound question about the nature of warfare's end. Victory on the battlefield appeared decisive. German forces had surrendered unconditionally. But victory in peace proved more complex. How could peace be established when the defeated feared their own liberation? An internal U.S. Army memorandum noted, "For the first time in military history, we are forced to consider the psychology of prisoners as much as the logistics of their transportation. The war may have ended, but suffering has not." The trains continued loading. The camps remained full. The questions multiplied. To understand the prisoners' fear required understanding the psychological impact of total war. The German soldiers in Allied camps had experienced combat's most extreme forms. Many had fought on the Eastern Front, where warfare reached levels of brutality without modern precedent. Casualties in single battles numbered in hundreds of thousands. Entire divisions were destroyed and reformed multiple times. Survival often depended on chance rather than skill. Allied medical officers began conducting systematic psychological evaluations of POWs requesting extended detention. The findings revealed patterns of severe trauma, depression, anxiety disorders, what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, combat fatigue, survivor's guilt. The men showed symptoms consistent with profound psychological distress. A report from British military psychiatrists at Camp Munster in Belgium noted, "High levels of depression and anxiety are evident among German POWs, particularly those from urban areas such as Berlin and Dresden. Many exhibit signs of emotional exhaustion. Several have expressed suicidal ideation when discussing repatriation." The prospect of returning to destroyed cities, possibly to find their families dead, appears to create unbearable psychological pressure. Letters from Germany, slowly reaching prisoners through restored postal services, reinforced their fears. A soldier at Camp 302 received a letter from his sister in Hamburg. The American censor's translation appeared in intelligence files. "Our street no longer exists. Mother and father are gone. I do not know where. I am living in a cellar with 12 other families. There is no work, no food. The Russians are coming from the east, and people say they are worse than the bombs. If you can stay where you are, stay. There is nothing here but death." Such letters circulated through camps, read and reread until the paper wore thin. They painted pictures of a Germany beyond recognition, cities without buildings, families without homes, an economy without function, a society without structure. The gap between prisoners' memories of home and the reality awaiting them created a psychological chasm difficult to bridge. American psychologist Captain Robert Morrison, assigned to evaluate prisoners at multiple camps, wrote in his June 1945 report, "These men are caught between two traumas. Behind them lies the horror of combat. Ahead lies the horror of return. They seek refuge in the present, in captivity, because it represents the only stability they have known in years. We are witnessing a mass psychological crisis for which military psychiatry has no adequate framework. The human mind, it appeared, could break as thoroughly as cities. Both required rebuilding. Neither process would be quick." Beyond psychological trauma, prisoners feared physical danger from their own countrymen. As Nazi Germany collapsed, the regime's carefully constructed mythology of racial superiority and inevitable victory had shattered. German civilians, subjected to years of propaganda, now faced defeat's bitter reality. Someone had to be blamed. Returning soldiers became convenient scapegoats. Intelligence reports from the American Office of Strategic Services documented increasing civilian hostility toward Wehrmacht veterans. In some towns, returning soldiers were accused of cowardice for having surrendered. In others, they were blamed for not defending cities adequately. Women whose husbands or sons had died in combat sometimes attacked returnees verbally or physically. The social fabric of Germany, strained by years of total war, was tearing apart. A German civilian's letter, intercepted by British intelligence in July 1945, revealed the atmosphere. "The soldiers are coming back, and no one wants them here. They lost the war. They brought this destruction upon us. They ate while we starved. Now they expect to come home as if nothing happened. Some have been beaten in the streets. The police do nothing because there are no police anymore." Prisoners in Allied camps heard these reports. Word spread quickly through the barbed wire compounds. Men from small towns and villages felt somewhat safer. Rural areas had suffered less bombing, and tight-knit communities might still function. But soldiers from major cities faced genuine danger. Berlin, in particular, had descended into lawlessness. Soviet occupation forces controlled the eastern sectors. The western sectors, under American, British, and French authority, maintained better order. But even there, survival required constant vigilance. An American intelligence officer's report from Camp Rennes in France stated, Several POWs mentioned that they would rather face an uncertain fate in our custody than return to the chaos in Germany. One prisoner, formerly a mechanic from Berlin, showed us a letter from his brother describing gangs roaming the streets at night, taking food and valuables by force. His brother advised him to stay away until order is restored, whenever that might be. The fear extended beyond immediate physical danger. Germany's economy had collapsed completely. The Reichsmark had become worthless. No jobs existed. Factories stood destroyed or idle. Farms in many regions had been abandoned or lay ruined. Even men who made it home safely would face the question, how do you survive in a country with no functioning economy? The Allied soldiers guarding the camps began to understand. Their prisoners feared freedom because freedom meant entering a void where all social structures had collapsed. Captivity, paradoxically, represented security. As summer 1945 progressed, Allied authorities confronted the legal and moral dimensions of the archival situation. The Geneva Conventions, codified in 1929 and updated through various protocols, established clear rules for prisoner treatment. Article 75 stated that prisoners of war must be released and repatriated without delay after the cessation of hostilities. No exceptions were specified. The law appeared absolute, but Allied commanders also recognized obligations under international humanitarian law more broadly. Forcing men to return to conditions where they might face starvation, violence, or death raised serious ethical questions. Could repatriation be considered humanitarian if it delivered men to devastation? Where did legal obligation end and moral responsibility begin? General Dwight D. Eisenhower addressed these concerns in a letter to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in August 1945. The letter, declassified in 1973, stated, "We are faced with a strange situation, prisoners requesting to stay rather than return to Germany. While Geneva requires repatriation, I am troubled by reports of conditions in German cities. Some camps hold men from Berlin and Hamburg who have received letters describing near-starvation conditions. Do we serve justice by forcing them into such circumstances?" Churchill's response, dated August 15th, acknowledged the dilemma, but stressed legal constraints. The law is clear, though the situation is unprecedented. We cannot maintain indefinite detention simply because prisoners prefer it. However, we might consider temporary labor programs that allow volunteers to work on European reconstruction in exchange for continued housing and rations. This would satisfy both legal requirements and humanitarian concerns. The U.S. State Department became involved in the policy discussions. Under Secretary of State Joseph Grew convened meetings with military lawyers and humanitarian organizations. The International Committee of the Red Cross provided input. Religious organizations advocated for compassionate treatment. Labor unions in France and Belgium expressed concerns about POW labor competing with civilian workers. A State Department memorandum from November 1945 emphasized, "The policy of forced repatriation may need to be reconsidered given the extreme circumstances within Germany. While we must respect international law, we must also acknowledge that conditions in some German cities are so severe that immediate repatriation could constitute a humanitarian crisis. A temporary reprieve might allow conditions to stabilize." The debates continued through Allied headquarters, government offices, and international organizations. Meanwhile, in the camps themselves, prisoners waited. They knew their fate was being decided in distant offices by officials who might never visit the ruins of Berlin or Hamburg. They could only hope that someone, somewhere, understood their fear. The question remained unanswered. What would the Allies decide? By October 1945, Allied authorities reached a compromise that attempted to balance legal obligations with humanitarian concerns. The policy, formalized in a joint directive from the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, established several categories of POWs with different repatriation timelines. Most prisoners would be repatriated according to original schedules. The Geneva Convention's requirements would be honored. However, a voluntary labor program would be established for prisoners who requested it. Those volunteering could work on reconstruction projects throughout France, Belgium, and the Low Countries in exchange for continued housing, rations, and modest pay. The program would last initially for 6 months, with possible extensions based on need and conditions in Germany. Approximately 45,000 German POWs volunteered immediately. They signed labor contracts agreeing to work on infrastructure repair, rubble clearance, agricultural projects, and reconstruction. French and Belgian authorities, desperate for labor to rebuild their own bombed cities, welcomed the arrangement. American and British occupation forces gained workers for various military construction projects. The remaining prisoners, the vast majority, began the journey home. Trains loaded daily from camps across France and Belgium. The men boarded with mixed emotions. Some felt relieved to return despite the hardships awaiting them. Others climbed aboard with visible fear. A few resisted until the last moment. Major William H. Hunt supervised one of the final large shipments from Camp 302 in December 1945. His report noted, "Today we processed 820 prisoners for repatriation to the American zone of Germany. Most accepted their orders without protest, though several wept openly. One prisoner, age 19, from Dresden, required physical escort to the train. He was not violent, simply unwilling to move voluntarily. He kept repeating, 'There is nothing there, nothing there.' We loaded him aboard nonetheless. The train departed at 1400 hours. The compromised policy satisfied no one completely. International lawyers argued it bent Geneva Convention requirements. Humanitarian organizations felt it did not go far enough to protect vulnerable prisoners. Labor unions continued protesting the use of POW workers. German officials, those few who had emerged in the occupation zones, objected to their citizens being retained. But the policy represented the possible in an impossible situation. Allied commanders had confronted a problem without precedent, enemy soldiers who feared their own liberation. The solution, forced repatriation for most, voluntary labor for some, reflected the messy reality of peace being harder than war. A U.S. Army memorandum from December 1945 concluded, "Though the majority of POWs are being repatriated, many have experienced prolonged stays beyond what was planned. The long-term effects remain to be seen." The prisoners who returned to Germany in late 1945 and early 1946 encountered the reality their letters had described. Cities lay in ruins. Infrastructure remained destroyed. Food remained scarce. The winter of 1945 through 1946 became known as the Hunger Winter, one of the coldest and most difficult in German history. Temperatures dropped below 0 Fahrenheit for extended periods. Coal for heating was almost impossible to obtain. In Berlin, civilians dismantled wooden structures for fuel. Parks were stripped of trees. Furniture was burned. People wrapped themselves in any available fabric and rarely left improvised shelters. Frostbite and hypothermia killed thousands. Food rations provided by occupation authorities barely sustained life. The official ration in the American zone provided approximately 1,500 calories daily. The British zone offered slightly less. The French zone, where resentment toward Germans ran highest, sometimes provided as little as 1,000 calories. All figures fell far below the 2,000 to 2,500 calories required for survival during cold weather. A report from the American military government in Germany, dated February 1946, documented the crisis. Malnutrition is universal among German civilians. Tuberculosis rates have increased 400%. Infant mortality has doubled. Medical facilities lack basic supplies. The combination of cold, hunger, and disease is creating a humanitarian emergency despite our relief efforts. The repatriated POWs entered this nightmare. Many found their families dead, missing, or displaced. Houses stood destroyed. Jobs did not exist. Former soldiers joined millions of German civilians in daily struggles for survival. Some turned to black markets, trading possessions for food. Others lived on foraging expeditions through rubble. A few, the most desperate, resorted to theft or begging. Psychological trauma compounded physical hardship. POWs returning from captivity often suffered what would later be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. Combat memories haunted them. Sleep brought nightmares. Loud noises triggered panic responses. But German society in 1946 had no framework for addressing mental health. Everyone was traumatized. Everyone was struggling. Individual suffering dissolved into collective misery. British military psychiatrists monitoring conditions in their occupation zone reported, "The returning POWs faced double trauma, war experience plus the shock of seeing their homeland destroyed. Many exhibit depression, anxiety, and social withdrawal. Without adequate mental health infrastructure, these men have no support beyond their immediate families, who are themselves traumatized." Some former prisoners regretted their choice to return. Letters sent back to POWs still in labor programs in France described the conditions and advised staying away longer. Those who had volunteered for labor programs felt confirmed in their decision. They worked hard rebuilding French and Belgian infrastructure, but they slept in beds, ate regular meals, and avoided the chaos-consuming Germany. The years 1946 through 1950 marked Germany's slow emergence from devastation. The Marshall Plan, announced by U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall in June 1947, provided crucial economic assistance. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States transferred approximately $13 billion in aid to Western Europe, roughly $150 billion in 2025 values. West Germany received approximately $1.4 billion. The aid accelerated reconstruction dramatically. Factories reopened, infrastructure was rebuilt. Currency reform in June 1948 stabilized the economy. The Deutsche Mark replaced the worthless Reichsmark. Markets began functioning again. Employment opportunities emerged. By 1950, West Germany's industrial production exceeded pre-war levels. But physical reconstruction proceeded faster than psychological recovery. The Germans who survived the war, civilians and soldiers alike, carried invisible scars. Depression rates remained elevated throughout the 1950s. Alcoholism became widespread. Domestic violence increased. Families fractured under stress. The generation that experienced the war struggled to resume normal life. The former POWs faced particular challenges. Many had difficulty adjusting to civilian employment after years of military structure and then captivity. Some experienced recurring nightmares. Others showed symptoms of what psychiatrists would later call survivor's guilt, struggling with why they lived when so many comrades died. German society, focused on rebuilding and moving forward, had little patience for those who could not keep pace. A 1948 report from the U.S. Army noted, "Germany's war survivors, both civilian and military, face a long road to recovery, both physically and mentally. While cities are being rebuilt and economic activity is resuming, the emotional toll persists. Many Germans appear to be functioning through sheer determination rather than genuine healing." The former prisoners who had worked in labor programs in France and Belgium began returning home in 1947 and 1948. They found Germany improving but still struggling. Some integrated successfully, using skills learned during the labor service to find employment in reconstruction projects. Others remained adrift, unable to establish stability. One former prisoner, interviewed by American researchers in 1949, reflected on his experience. I volunteered for labor service in France. I helped rebuild a bridge near Lyon. When I finally returned to Hamburg in 1948, the city was still ruined, but food was available again. I found work with a construction company. But at night, I still dream of the war. I still see the faces of men who died. The bombs may have stopped falling, but they still echo in my head. The physical reconstruction of Germany would largely be complete by 1960. The emotional reconstruction would take generations. The request of German POWs to remain in captivity revealed truths about war's aftermath that military planners had never anticipated. Warfare's end, traditionally marked by victory celebrations and homecoming parades, proved far more complex. The distinction between captivity and freedom blurred when freedom meant entering devastation. The definition of victory became ambiguous when the defeated feared their own liberation. Allied authorities learned painful lessons about the comprehensive nature of total war. World War II had not simply destroyed military forces, it had destroyed entire societies, infrastructure, economy, social structure, psychological well-being. The conflict's scale meant that ending fighting did not end suffering. In some ways, suffering intensified as people confronted what they had lost. The POW repatriation crisis forced a broader recognition of war's hidden costs. Casualty statistics measured deaths on battlefields, but failed to capture deaths from starvation afterward. Destruction estimates counted buildings lost, but not families shattered. Victory announcements proclaimed triumph, but ignored trauma persisting for decades. General Lucius D. Clay, military governor of the American occupation zone in Germany, addressed these realities in a 1951 speech. Germany's greatest challenge was not rebuilding its cities, but rebuilding its people. Bricks and steel can be replaced in years. Human lives, once broken, may never fully heal. We won the war in 1945. We are still winning the peace. The psychological impact extended beyond Germany's borders. Allied soldiers who had served as POW camp guards sometimes struggled with their own trauma. They had witnessed the prisoners' fear and desperation. They had forced men onto trains, knowing those men faced possible death from starvation. They had followed orders, but questioned whether those orders served justice. An American guard at Camp 302, interviewed in 1953, recalled, "I remember loading prisoners onto trains in December 45. Some were crying. One kid, couldn't have been more than 18, kept saying his family was dead and he had nowhere to go. But we had orders. Geneva Convention said they had to be repatriated, so we put him on that train. I think about that kid sometimes. I wonder if he made it." War's true costs appeared only in retrospect. The immediate aftermath brought chaos. Years later, historians could calculate statistics. Deaths from combat, approximately 60 to 85 million globally. Deaths from starvation and disease. Estimates ranged into tens of millions. Psychological trauma, unmeasurable but universal among survivors. The prisoners who begged to remain in captivity had understood what others learned slowly. Sometimes the worst consequences of war came after the shooting stopped. By the 1950s, West Germany had achieved remarkable economic recovery. The Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle, transformed the devastated landscape into a prosperous industrial society. Unemployment fell, wages rose. Consumer goods became available. The bombed cities rebuilt themselves with modern architecture. Germany rejoined the international community. But the emotional legacy remained. An entire generation carried war's psychological weight. The men who had been prisoners, whether returned immediately or after labor service, lived with memories that never faded completely. Their children grew up in homes shadowed by unspoken trauma. Their grandchildren would eventually ask questions about a past their elders preferred not to discuss. The phenomenon of POWs requesting to remain in captivity became a footnote in history. Official records documented it. Military reports filed it away. But the broader public largely forgot this strange episode. Post-war narratives focused on liberation and recovery, not on the complexity and pain between surrender and stability. Historians examining the period would later recognize the POW requests as revealing something fundamental about modern warfare's nature. Total war destroyed not just armies, but entire ways of life. Victory did not restore what existed before. The world that emerged from World War II was irrevocably different. The prisoners who feared going home understood they could never truly go home. The home they remembered no longer existed. A 1954 statement by the International Committee of the Red Cross reflected on the war's humanitarian lessons. The true cost of war is borne not by the victors or the vanquished, but by those who survived to rebuild. We have learned that military victory represents only the beginning of peace, not its achievement. The healing of nations requires decades, and the healing of individuals may never be complete. The men who asked to remain prisoners eventually returned to Germany. Most lived ordinary lives, working, raising families, growing old. They rarely spoke of their experiences. When asked about the war, they offered brief answers and changed subjects. The fear they felt in 1945, the choice they made to delay freedom, remained private memories. But those memories mattered. They testified to war's comprehensive destruction. They revealed that captivity could seem safer than liberation when liberation meant chaos. They showed that freedom meant nothing without the societal structures necessary to sustain it. Most fundamentally, they proved that war's end did not mean suffering's end. The barbed wire of POW camps came down. But invisible barriers, trauma, loss, fear, remained standing for years afterward. Today, few monuments mark the POW camps of 1945. The temporary structures were dismantled decades ago. The land returned to agricultural use or urban development. Only archival documents preserve the names of prisoners who requested to stay. Only military reports record the camps where freedom was refused. Yet the story carries meaning beyond its historical particulars. It reveals war's aftermath as a time of confusion, pain, and difficult choices. It shows that victory celebrations obscure complex human realities. It demonstrates that the line between winning and losing blurs when everyone has lost something fundamental. The German POWs who begged to remain prisoners were not cowards. They were traumatized men facing an impossible choice between different forms of suffering. Their request to stay reflected rational assessment of terrible options. Captivity offered food, shelter, and order. Freedom offered hunger, homelessness, and chaos. They chose survival. Their story reminds us that war's costs extend far beyond casualties counted on battlefields. Every bomb that destroyed a building also destroyed someone's home. Every city reduced to rubble also reduced lives to rubble. Every victory created new problems. Every ending marked a beginning of something darker. The Allied officers who confronted POW refusal to accept freedom faced their own impossible choice. Follow law and force repatriation, possibly sending men to their deaths. Bend law and allow extended detention, possibly violating international agreements. They chose compromise, a pragmatic solution to a problem no one had anticipated. History judges their decision as imperfect but humane. They acknowledged complexity rather than imposing simplistic solutions. They recognized that post-war justice required more than following regulations. They understood, however imperfectly, that true peace required addressing human needs alongside legal requirements. The final document in the archive of Camp 302, dated June 1948, records the last German POW departing for home. 3 years after the war ended. 3 years of labor, recovery, and preparation. The report notes simply, All prisoners repatriated. Camp operations concluded. Facility to be dismantled. The words were bureaucratic, clinical. But behind them lay thousands of human stories. Stories of fear conquered, stories of lives rebuilt, stories of men who once begged to remain prisoners but finally found courage to face freedom. They returned home to a Germany transformed. They carried memories that would never transform. They lived the rest of their lives knowing they had witnessed war's truth. The hardest battles often come after the fighting ends.